Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 12th Zee Jaipur Literature Festival's Charbagh. We're delighted to introduce Session 8, The Puranas. We have Bibek Debroy discussing his translation of the Bhagavad Puranas in conversation with academic and historian Pushpesh Pant. Let's welcome them on stage with a huge round of applause. Over to you.
Is this a little better? If this is a little better, we can begin. I must make two admissions right at the outset. I'm a great fan of Dr. Bibek Debroy, and I have been indebted by his translations of Mahabharata, Valmiki Ramayana, and an earlier rendering of the Puranas. So I am a biased party as far as that is concerned. And the second qualification I should make at the outset is I have been introduced as an academician and a historian. And I think neither the history department in JNU or Delhi University would recognize that. And I have exerted very little academically. So my presence here is entirely as a person who is involved with our cultural inheritance, of which I think the Puranas are a very important part. I also recall a conversation a few years back with the same distinguished person on the same dais, where we were talking about what Puranas are and what the significance is. I think it is relevant that before we come to his latest translation of the Bhagavad Puran, I ask him, what are Purans? And I think you had explained it brilliantly that they have 5 Lakshans and they have this and they are not this. But I think the relationship of Purans with other literature in India, sacred and not so sacred, is interesting. Where do they fit in? Where do they fit in, for instance, with Ramayana and Mahabharata? And there is a hierarchy of Purans. So the second question which I wanted to ask you is, why choose Bhagavad Puran first of all? What is so special about it?
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me also state very clearly my biases to start off with, which is that it is always wonderful to have a conversation with someone like Pushpesh Pant. And indeed, at this very same venue, there was a conversation earlier, if I recall, about the Mahabharata. This is meant to be in a question-answer format, so let me just react to what Pushpesh Pant just said, and then we will take the conversation forward. There are major Puranas and there are minor Puranas. When I use the word Puranas from now on, I mean the major Puranas, Mahapuranas. The list of 18 Mahapuranas, there are 18 of them, is more or less standardized and uniform, barring very marginal differences. All of these Puranas give a classic definition of what a Purana is. A Purana is supposed to exhibit Pancha Lakshmana, 5 traits or 5 characteristics or 5 attributes. What are these? Firstly, they must describe the original act of creation and the eventual destruction. The second characteristic, within that cycle of overall creation and destruction, there are secondary cycles of creation and destruction. They must describe that. Third, they must describe the different eras which are known as Manvantaras, each presided over by a certain Manu. Fourth, they must describe the genealogies and the antecedents of the gods, the Devas and the Rishis. And finally, fifth, they must describe the royal genealogies, which means the Surya Vansha and the Chandra Vansha. All the Puranas, to greater or lesser degree, satisfy these 5 characteristics. However, the Puranas are much, much more than that. They represent encyclopedias. The Puranas are not only the stories that you see in simple renderings of the Puranas, be it in the print medium, be it in the electronic medium. They're encyclopedias of information about what we did in our day-to-day practices, in how we practiced and interpreted dharma, how we conducted ourselves, what happened in daily life, how we constructed temples, how we constructed images, how we undertook funeral rites. All of these are in the Puranas. To give you some idea of the size involved, the Puranas vary enormously in length. The shortest Purana is about 8,000 odd shlokas. One shloka translates into about 20 words, if I'm doing a conversion into the English language. And the longest Purana, which is the Skanda Purana, is 85,000 shlokas. So altogether, if one were to convert it into English, the 18 Mahapuranas together would amount to something like 12 to 15 million words. What you need to realize is that some Puranas are more popular than others. And arguably the most popular Purana is the Bhagavad Purana, which is read, or at least the 10th Skanda. The Bhagavad Purana has several parts known as Skandas. The 10th Skanda is read quite a bit. Many of these Puranas have never been translated into English. The Bhagavad Purana is not like that. It has been translated in the past. The reason I started with the Bhagavad Purana is I wanted to start with a Purana that most people identify with, however vaguely. My intention, of course, is to translate all the 18 Puranas.
I know the translations are never going to stop either in your lifetime or in my lifetime. But the other interesting question which has been intriguing me is this, that we come back to Bhagavad Purana in a minute, that all the Puranas either are dealing with one of the avatas or one of the Panchabhutas, Vayu Purana, Agni Purana or Sthal Purana. You have the Shiv Purana, but then you also have a lot of repetition. So when you have the Bhagavad Purana, which is narrated and read more often than other Puranas, does it take care of its sizing, the repetition? Does it add something to it? And if you recall that the writing type period in which the Puranas were written dates from 4th, 5th centuries AD to 15th century AD. Some are very recent, some are really ancient. So how do they relate to each other?
This has a bearing on the question that was asked earlier. At that point, I did not duck the question, I merely postponed it. In popular perception, there is almost a linear relationship over time. One tends to presume that at some point the Valmiki Ramayana was composed, the Mahabharata was composed after that, and the Puranas were composed after that. I am extremely skeptical about anyone who suggests such a neat, linear transition over time. I don't think that is what happened at all. I think these texts all evolved parallelly. To give an example of what I mean, in the Mahabharata, we are told that Shuka, Vyasdeva's son, attained moksha. He merged into nature. If that is the case, and if the Puranas were composed later on, how is it the case that we have Shukra recounting stories in the Puranas? The point I'm making is, today we have 18 Purana texts. It is by no means obvious that we originally had 18 Purana texts. There was probably a corpus of what was the original Purana, and there was a back and forth between the Valmiki Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and the Puranas. Quite often you will find people saying there is no reference to the Mahabharata in the Valmiki Ramayana. So the Valmiki Ramayana must have been composed earlier. If I say here, Na tvang shochitum arhasi, half the people here will identify it with the Bhagavad Gita. And where is this expression from? This expression, of course, is from the Bhagavad Gita, but it is an expression that occurs in the Valmiki Ramayana. If I mention Yayati, the story of Yayati, most people here will identify it as a story from the Mahabharata. But how is it that there is a reference to the Jayati story in the Valmiki Ramayana? I'm citing these examples to illustrate the point that I think these were all parallel evolutions. And there is always a difference between how a text was originally composed and its eventual state of completion. When we say dating the Puranas, we mean the eventual stage of finalization of that particular text. Some Puranas are older. The Matsya Purana is older. The Vishnu Purana is older. Some other Puranas, like the Brahma Vaivarta Purana, they are later. And the range, it's very difficult to date these, but the range would be something like 3rd century to even the 12th century. So that is the range that we are talking about. Sometimes these 18 Puranas are artificially divided into 3 silos. Puranas identified with Brahma. These are Puranas that emphasize creation. Puranas identified with Shiva, which tend to glorify Shiva in comparison with Vishnu, and Puranas that tend to relatively glorify Vishnu. I personally think that this is an artificial distinction because all 18 Puranas emphasize all 3, except of course in some cases there is a relative superiority of Vishnu and a relative superiority of Shiva in other cases. The Bhagavad Puran is of course a Vishnu type Puran. It is a Puran that is heavy on theory, metaphysics and theology. So it builds up the entire edifice of what Vaishnavas believe in. It builds on the Bhagavad Gita. It embellishes the Bhagavad Gita. And today almost everything that any type of Vaishnava believes in, the theology, and I'm using the word theology deliberately, is based on the Bhagavad Puran.
Another question which sort of suddenly starts bothering me is, you mentioned that the Puran was so much. It was an encyclopedia, it was a compendium of custom, ritual. It also had stories, genealogy, geographical information. So how does these two all the Panchalakshanas balance within a Puran, especially Bhagavad Puran? Because like you said, Bhagavad Puran reading or recitation is almost like a Akhanda Ramayana part. It is almost like a ritual. Is the narrative part of Bhagavad Puran a bit of infotainment or sugar coating of information, difficult to digest, theological or metaphysical? Do the two parts of Bhagavad Puran also make an attempt to revise and contemporize the information about the geography, cosmology, and so on? Do they make an effort? Specifically, does the Bhagavad Puran acquire its popularity by its resilience or reconciliation of contending points of view in other Puranas? How has it emerged as the most popular one?
Let me give an example from the Bhagavad Puran, a story from the Bhagavad Puran to illustrate the point I was trying to make earlier. This is a story that is familiar with most of us. And as Pushpesh Pant said earlier, the same story sometimes occurs in more than one Puran with minor variations. So let me recount this story from the Bhagavad Puran. And what is this famous story? Bali is the king of the Asuras. There is no particular evidence of Bali having been evil at all. On the contrary, Bali was a very generous person. However, Bali, being an Asura, drove Indra out from heaven. And Indra, by the way, is a title. Indra is not a proper name. This particular Indra's proper name is Purandar. So Bali drove Indra out of heaven and assumed the title of Indra. So Indra, as quite often happens, meaning Purandar, as quite often happens, went running to Vishnu so that Vishnu could save him and retrieve heaven back for him. Vishnu disguised himself in the form of a dwarf Brahmana. And knowing that Bali was very generous and would not refuse anyone who came to ask him for a gift, turned up in the form of this dwarf Brahmana and asked Bali for a gift. And Bali said, "What do you want? What do you want me to give you?" And in the form of the Vamana avatar, the dwarf incarnation, Vishnu said, "I want as much of land as can be covered in 3 of my strides." So the first stride, he covered the earth and everything else. In the second stride, he covered the firmament, heaven. And then he asked Bali, "Where am I going to put my third foot?" And Bali said, "Place it on my head." And Bali was thereby vanished into the nether regions. This is a story most people here are familiar with. What does the Bhagavad Puran say? I'm getting into the details now. The preceptor of the Asuras is Shukracharya. Shukracharya knows that Vishnu is about to commit this act of deception. So Shukracharya goes to Bali and says, "Look, this Vamana, this dwarf Brahmana is actually Vishnu in disguise. Please don't listen to him." Bali says, "I have already pledged. I've given him my pledge that I will give him whatever I want." In our system, whether we remember it or not now, we probably tend to forget, before I pledge anything, I am supposed to touch water. And I am supposed to say Om. Shukracharya tells Bali, "Listen, you touched water, but you did not say Om. So therefore the contract, so to speak, is null and void because you did not say Om. Until you've said Om, the contract is not a valid contract." Bali says, "It doesn't matter to me. The intent of the law is more important than the letter of the law. So I've given him my word, so therefore I've given him my word." Whereupon Shukracharya also curses Bali. Now, you look at this, what this is also trying to teach you is
lessons on hospitality and generosity. When we think of Hinduism, we normally tend to define Hinduism in terms of Vedanta. The Vedanta, all the texts of Vedanta were composed by people who went off on Vanaprastha and Sannyas. These were metaphysical speculations by them. Do you think the average householder then identified with the esoteric or the relatively esoteric tenets of Vedanta? Of course not. The average householder then did exactly what the average householder does today, which is make money, improve his standard of living, take care of his relatives, and the Puranas are about that kind of dharma. What do I do as a householder? And you have stories about how, this is a story that Swami Vivekananda was fond of recounting. This is about a fowler who comes and captures a female bird. And the fowler is very hungry and thirsty and it is raining. And the female bird has been trapped in that cage. And the female bird tells the male bird, which is up there on the tree, that we have got a guest. We need to feed the guest. So the male bird comes and lights a fire, manages to light a fire. It gathers dry leaves and goes and brings a little bit of fire from somewhere else in the forest, lights the fire. It immerses itself in the fire so that the fowler can have a meal. Then the baby birds come and do that. So these kinds of lessons about hospitality, generosity, all of these are lessons that are taught in the Puranas. That is why I said the Puranas represent dharma for the average person much more than Vedanta did. It's not that I'm suggesting there is a conflict between Vedanta and the Puranas. It is the lessons of Vedanta which were popularized through these stories so that people imbibe those lessons.
For centuries, this may have been true. For generations, this may have been true. But we live in rather interesting times, as the Chinese say. And the problem is that Purans are also synonymous with something which is ancient, Purane. And the moment you call somebody Puranic or an idea Puranic, especially after the Science Congress, where some distinguished or not so distinguished scientists came out with the view that Mahabharata and Ramayana were history, and Puranas described facts of life, not fantasy or allegories or metaphors or whatever it is. So the morality part or the ethics part gets forgotten. And you say that whatever is Puranic is not relevant for contemporary times, particularly 21st century modern scientific outlook and so on. So who has the time to get into the metaphors, or the ethics or the moral precepts also change with times. So how much of that is of relevance, particularly in the context of Bhagavad Purana?
I strongly disagree with that statement. The reason I strongly disagree with that statement is the first thing we should do to figure out what is relevant or what is not relevant is to read it. Apart from dumbed down versions of the Purana stories in print and on television, how many of us have bothered to read the Puranas? Not even the people who said various things at the Science Congress. I mentioned the translations, and let me stress this again. In the English language, many of these Puranas have not been translated at all. And the last time some of these Puranas were translated, some were in the 19th century. And the last time anyone seriously explored the Puranas for the treasure trove of knowledge that they contain was Parjitar in the 19th century. So before dismissing them, before accepting them, let us at least read what is in them. Now let me get provoked and by extension react to the statement that you said implicitly.
Ramayana, Mahabharata, Puranas, they talk about Divyastras. They talk about Vimanas, although some of the things that were mentioned have nothing to do with the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and the Puranas. They have a lot to do with a text known as Vaimanik Shastram, which is an early 20th century text. It is not something that is very old. Did we possess the technology? Completely wrong question to ask. If you go by the description of the Ramayana, the Mahabharata and the Puranas, whether it is the Divyastras, whether it is the Vimanas, whether it is Pushpak Vimana or Brahmastra or whatever it was always obtained from the gods. There is not a single instance humans manufactured them. So therefore the Puranas themselves and the Ramayana Mahabharata itself, they suggest we did not possess this technology. There is indeed a depiction of a civilization, which is the civilization of the gods, which is distinct from the civilization of humans, and they possess some technology know-how, if I'm going to use modern day jargon. So to stress the point I'm making, first let us read.
Reading is a problem because there are sessions on Sanskrit Paninis and Sanskrit's relationship with Latin and Greek later in the festival. But I think because they were written in Sanskrit, like the Valmiki Ramayana, after a certain period of time, they were not accessible to the common man. I recall reading the Puranas for the first time, the Gita Press Hindi translations, which probably good or bad translations, something was lost in the translations. My other memory from childhood is the recitation of a Purana after a person dies, a Garuda Purana or a Bhagavad recitation in the village. And the Pandit who was doing the recitation was bowdlerizing the more objectionable erotic descriptions of the gods and goddesses' sex life. They also followed sectarian agenda about a particular thing. So when most people had a second-hand transmission of what the Puranas contained, didn't a dumbing down take place almost automatically, partly intentionally, partly unintentionally? The second part about the dumbing down of the Puranas again leaves me a little disturbed, because even if I had access to a Puran in an Amar Chitrakatha version, and if the cartoonist and the condenser had taken the trouble to keep the essence or the essential message intact, why would I be worried about the dumbing down? Because that would prepare or seed the ground for me to undertake something like translation, which you do, which is a literal translation, not with literary flourishes, but which is maintains the fidelity with the original.
I'm going to react to that at several different levels. Etat mama mitram Pushpesh Mahodaya tena saha adhuna Purana Vishaye kinchit vartalapam karomi. The chances are that many people here understood exactly what I said, or at least you got the sense of what I said. In other words, I know there are other sessions on Sanskrit. In other words, Sanskrit is not as difficult as we tend to think it is. And if I'm talking about the Ramayana, the Mahabharata and the Puranas, and I am not talking about Kalidas or Bhartrihari or literature of that type, it is reasonably simple Sanskrit. Anyone who knows any Indian language, I think without a great deal of difficulty, will be able to understand that kind of Sanskrit. We use it all the time in mantras that we recite without realizing that these things are from the Puranas. Some of you may actually be reciting something that you know as Ratri Suktam. Tvang Swaha, Tvang Swadha, Tvang Hivashatkara, Swaratmika.
you will probably not know it is from the Markandeya Purana. Sarva Mangala Mangalle Shive Sarvartha Sadhike, you will probably not know it is from the Markandeya Purana. So implicitly we know some of this stuff, except we don't recognize it because we don't explore the Puranas. The second response I have is actually the Gita plus translations are pretty good. By and large, I'm not talking about the abridged translations, I'm talking about the unabridged translations. Almost all the vernacular unabridged translations of the Puranas I'm familiar with are reasonably decent. The problem is not there. The problem is twofold. Firstly, increasingly people don't even read the vernacular. And secondly, increasingly we want everything in 140 or 280 Twitter characters. We want 2-minute noodles. We don't have the time. Now, if you are going to do that, you will have a dumbing down, almost definitionally. In school, we used to do Presi. I don't know whether it still exists or not. If you do Presi, automatically you will have to simplify. Automatically you will have to do a dumbing down. Automatically you have to do a glossing over. So my plea to everyone is, I've got nothing against the dumbed down versions. But having read the dumbed down versions, at some point one should graduate to the complete text, unabridged, in the vernacular, in English, in Sanskrit, in whatever, because abridged will mean dumbing down.
I have another question specifically about translations. And when you started translating the Mahabharata, there was always available a whole lot of standard versions, annotated versions, and for Valmiki Ramayana to a lesser extent it was there. But when you mentioned that the Puranas were not translated till very recently, till 19th century, was there a particular difficulty which you faced that there was no standard text available of a particular Puran?
Okay, let me answer this question in context. For the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the essential story of the Mahabharata, the Sanskrit Mahabharata, is the same everywhere in the country. But you had slightly different versions. Minor differences in nuance. When Draupadi was being disrobed, did she actually pray to Krishna, or did she pray to someone anonymous? Who saved her? Did Vedavyas actually dictate to Ganesha, or did he not? These kinds of minor differences. So altogether in India, there were about 1,215 different versions of the Mahabharata floating around. Very similar but minor differences here and there. The Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute in Pune sat down with all of these 1,215 versions and prepared what is referred to as the critical text. Now, do not misunderstand the use of the word critical. It is not authentic what the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute in Pune did between the years of 1916 and 1966. It took them 50 years. Is something that is fairly common in genetic studies. This is a bit like HCF in schools as common factor. If a shloka occurred in the maximum number of versions that I have of the text, the likelihood is pretty high that this was in the original text. So for the Mahabharata, I have this critical text. Exactly similarly for the Valmiki Ramayana, there are about 200 different texts floating around. And the Oriental Research Institute in Baroda in the 1970s, following the tradition set by the Bhandarkar for the Mahabharata, produced the critical text of the Valmiki Ramayana. So when I did the translations of the Mahabharata and the Valmiki Ramayana, life was simpler because I had the critical versions to use. What Pushpesh Pant is asking me is, in the case of the Puranas, we have no such critical edition. So which version are you going to use? And indeed, this was a difficult decision. Since I have decided that I am going to translate all the 18 Puranas, I needed to choose an edition that had the text of all the 18 Puranas. Not that I needed to, but it makes sense for purposes of consistency. The edition that is accepted by most scholars as reasonably accurate and reasonably good is something that was brought out by Nirnaya Sagar, which has been reprinted subsequently. So essentially I am using the Nirnaya Sagar editions. And remember, Sanskrit originally was a spoken language. It was not written down. And sometimes when you are writing down, the person who was copying the manuscript was not necessarily particularly literate. And it is very easy to make a mistake with the matras. So dharma can easily become dharma with disastrous consequences for the meaning. So the Nirnaya Sagar edition is regarded as the most authentic edition, and that's the one I've been following.
This takes us to another interesting question. You make a distinction between the spoken language and the written language and the difference that might make into a translation. There also is a usage problem. A certain kind, I mean, the James Old Testament version or the New Testament version or a Bible being rendered, it is, Quran Sharif of course is never translated, or you have the Gita as it is of the ISKCON variety, or you have Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley and other translators. You also a little earlier made a very interesting point about when we are talking of Puranas, we are not talking of Kalidas. You mentioned Bhartrihari, Apasa also somewhere. But the interesting part is that there might be a kernel of a Puranic wisdom in a classical literary play. There might be a resonance in a Bhartrihari shloka. And how do you, in contemporary India, which is used to a English or not familiar with its own mother tongue in most parts, where if you were talking of say 50 years back, probably everybody anywhere would be familiar with a little bit of Sanskrit of Mantrochara. But in today's India, the mantra chanting Hindu would be a Manuvadi, Brahmanic revivalist perceived by common man. And the Adi Dravids would not recognize the Sanskritic Vedic heritage at all. So you would have this problem of Savarna Hindus, Brahmanic domination, North-South domination, and the language which, without hurting political sensibilities, says that this is a common heritage of the subcontinent.
Again, I can react to this in many different ways. The first way I would react to it is people whom we identify as people who compose literature were quite clearly familiar with stories from the Puranas and stories from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. In the 19th century and even the early 20th century, people were familiar with these stories. My great lamentation is that compared to 100 years ago, we have forgotten these stories. We have forgotten this treasure house of knowledge. I said 18 Puranas. It is quite clear that these Puranas were not necessarily composed in the same geographical parts, because they exhibit, I told you earlier that there is an enormous amount of geographical knowledge also in the Puranas. And it is patently obvious that some Puranas are familiar with the geography of certain parts of the country more than that of others. For example, the Bhagavad Purana was quite clearly composed in the southern parts of the country. For example, everyone here
will be familiar with the story of Vishnu's avatars, and particularly the Matsya or the Meena avatar, where a fish appears before Manu, before that great deluge. And where does the fish appear before Manu? When he's gone to the river to have a bath. What is the name of that river? All of us know that story. Well, what is the river called? The Bhagavad Puran tells us, because the Bhagavad Puran, as I said, was composed clearly in the southern parts of the country. And the name of that river, according to the Bhagavad Purana, is Kritamala. And where is Kritamala? Kritamala is a tributary now of the Vaiga. So the Kritamala today is a Nala near the Madurai railway station, except no one remembers that that is the famous Kritamala. So the Puranas, the Markandeya Purana, clearly composed in the eastern parts. Large sections of the Skanda Puran, clearly composed in and around the area of Ujjain, in and around the area of Varanasi. So the Puranas extended the entire expanse of the country in terms of the composition. But finally, you asked a question about the legacy of Sanskrit. I happen to think, and some people from a certain part of the south or a certain state in the south will get very aggravated at my statement, and I would ask them to look at the state of literature there before there was an attempt to consciously purge literature of all Sanskrit influences about 200 years ago. In greater or lesser degree, I think all Indian languages have drawn about Sanskrit. Now, before you misunderstand, I am not suggesting for a minute that it was a one-way process. It was a two-way process. Sanskrit influenced Indian languages, other so-called vernacular languages influenced Sanskrit. There was a free flow between one and the other. The last bit is you are essentially saying very politely, hey, look here, Bibek, some people must think you're mad. And indeed, yes, some people do think I'm mad, so be it.
I think we have had a wonderful discussion. We are reaching the last quarter of an hour of the allotted time. So I think the audience, if it wants to chip in, we are free to... Yes, sir.
Hello. Good afternoon, sir. Military history with a keen eye on the future of India. Could you please tell us what is mentioned in the Bhavishya Puran regarding the future of India, Bharatvarsha, vis-a-vis two things basically. First, in what time frame do we become a superpower? And second, when and in what time frame do we get honest, dedicated, die-hard, good politicians and a stable government?
Firstly, I would urge you to read the Bhavishya Puran for yourself. Just as in passing I mentioned, even 100 years ago, even 70 years ago, people were much more aware of these texts than they are today. Despite being in the army, I'm not very sure that you have read a book by Dikshitar. Does that ring a bell? Precisely. It proves my point. A book by Dikshitar called War in Ancient India. Dikshitar was from the army. The difference, of course, is that 70 years ago, people from the army were familiar with these texts. The second response I would have
is the Bhavishya Puran is a text one needs to be a little bit careful about. Because the Bhavishya Puran is a text that is a somewhat unreliable text, because there are references to an original Bhavishya Puran. Whether that text exists satisfactorily or not is open to doubt, because some versions of the Bhavishya Puran also mention Queen Victoria. So therefore, this cannot have been the original Bhavishya Puran. So when you read translations of the Bhavishya Puran, be a little bit careful. The third response would be in terms of a superpower. The word superpower is of relatively recent coinage. The Puranas, as I've been trying to suggest to you, are about things that are a bit more permanent, and therefore they take little cognizance of temporary notions of who is a power and who is a superpower. These come and go. These are temporary. Tantiti khashya bharata. But the other response I would have is what the Puranas tell us very clearly is, if you have a bad king, it is your responsibility to get rid of the bad king. So you as a citizen cannot run away from that responsibility. So therefore, my last response to your question would be, to ensure that India develops, to ensure that India is better governed, to ensure that India prospers, please make the right decisions.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Debroy, my name is Dimple. I represent Mind Makers. It's a new age portal. I've read your work. I have two questions. One is that I recently came across a review of your work, A Year with Mahapuranas, by two preteens, the Agarwal sisters. And they had read your English translations, and it was pretty interesting to see kids write about it and review a book. And I was wondering, had they been able to read it in Sanskrit, how lovely would it be? So my first question is, do you think there's a case for teaching Sanskrit as a language so that, as you rightly said, that people don't know about it, there's no awareness, so that awareness spreads? That is one. Second question is, between Bibek Debroy, the Sanskrit scholar, and Bibek Debroy, the economist, who do you like to spend your time more with? Thank you.
You see, the first question, Pushpesh Pant hinted at it in the initial introductions. I translated the Puranas earlier, but they were abridged translations, and they were terrible translations. They happened to be still popular, but they were terrible translations. And by the way, the Bhavishya Puran is also translated there. So I'm not proud of those translations anymore. They were done several years ago. They were done more than 25 years ago. But clearly, those abridged translations appealed. And the Agarwal sisters used those abridged translations. And I'm delighted that they actually took out the time to read the Purana stories, to actually do reviews of them of a sort, and then publish it as a book. But the direct answer to your question is, I happen to think that Sanskrit is taught very, very badly. And one of the reasons why people are put off Sanskrit is because it is taught so very, very badly. Because people are forced to memorize grammar tables. Sanskrit is a language like any other language. It is bhasha. Bhasha means something that you speak. It does not mean something you memorize. So any language, the way we learnt all the other languages, we learnt how to speak it. And then we made mistakes, and the mistakes were corrected. No one forced us to learn grammar tables. So yes, Sanskrit is very badly taught, but that's not my job. But I agree with you that it should be taught better.
I think I'll just chip in here before he answers your second question. I think it should be common knowledge that Bibek Da did not study Sanskrit in school or college. He taught Sanskrit to himself because of his love for Sanskrit and attained a level of proficiency which is in envy for people who have studied it.
Now the second question is a tougher question to answer. The simple reason is I have a full-time job. I have a full-time job, but I also recognize that if I did not do whatever I am doing in the area of economics, there would be someone else who would do that job. But in the area of the translations, I am not able to think of anyone else who would do that, who's crazy enough to do that. So if there ever were to be a trade-off between the two, there is no trade-off today, but if there were ever to be a trade-off between the two, I would opt for the translations and give up the other one.
And I think I will again chip in out of turn, because if you recall the Nobel laureate is Chandrasekhar's book on Beethoven and other things. Actually, ultimately, for a person who's a polymath like Bibek Da, it is the satisfaction is aesthetic. So even when he's doing economics, I'm sure there is a sublime music playing in his mind. And when he's doing Sanskrit, the same thing happens. So the choice is not in binaries for him. And those who appreciate his work, I think the distinction is not there at all. We have time for a few more questions. Two, maybe. Yes, in the middle row.
No, but can I just say something else in addition? Because a thought just occurred to me. At the moment, I'm just translating. But in the Purana stories, this demon has visits houses where there are newly born children. So it goes to someone's house, steals the newly born child, takes it to someone else's house where there's a newly born child, replaces that one, takes that child to somewhere else, and every third child she devours. Straight from the Puranas. But think about it. Every third child she devours. It is telling us that every third child died. It is telling us that the infant mortality rate whenever this Purana was composed was 333 per thousand. Now I'm stressing this because I wish, I don't have the time to do this, but I wish someone sat down with the Puranas and explored the Puranas for what they tell.
Who is looking to take principles from all these texts and apply these in real life, can you suggest me how am I supposed to look at it? Some texts which portray it as just as a purely political narrative, which one side became lucky and the other side became unlucky, and rather than something which is just good and bad.
Who said anything about good and bad?
The popular texts that we have been reading from since childhood.
What have you been reading since childhood?
So, okay, to put it in plain terms, one side was good, the Pandavas were good, the other side was bad.
To put it in plain terms, you've been reading dumbed down versions.
Okay.
The Mahabharata does not say this is good and that is bad. Duryodhan is referred to as Suyodhan by several people, not just by his father, but by Yudhishthira also. So this thing that you're presenting to me as the Pandavas were good and the Kauravas are bad are dumbed down versions. If there is one lesson in the Mahabharata, if there is one lesson in the Puranas, if there is one lesson in the Valmiki Ramayana,
It is that there is nothing good, there is nothing bad. These are absolute notions which have no relevance. So my plea to you is rediscover these texts as they are.
We are reaching almost the end of the allotted time. May I request the questions to be very brief? There are both there.
Good afternoon. My question is that we've seen that in places like Germany, they say that if you don't have Sanskrit scholars, come to us. Also, there was a floodgate of applications across the globe for applying for Sanskrit courses, unlike in India. My question is that linking some political ideologies have been linking the language with certain ideologue or religion. Is it detrimental to the rich heritage the language has? Are we missing out on many things because of this reason?
Whose responsibility is it to ensure that this legacy, this language is not lost? It is not the responsibility of the universities of Heidelberg and Cambridge and Oxford or Columbia. It is our collective responsibility. And I will repeat what I said earlier. It is our responsibility to ensure that this treasure house of knowledge does not die out. It is our collective responsibility to ensure that we read it. It is our responsibility that we read it before we dismiss it as it said this or it did not say that. Please let us read it first.
I think there is one last question in the same last row there. There were two hands which were raised there, unless they have made good their escape. So I think one question here and the last question here. In the front row, last black shirt. This is the last one. I have a watch right here.
So my question is a follow-on. As someone pointed out, there are many dialogical deconstructionist texts which is being produced. For example, I remember reading something on Panchkanyas. So it's very confusing as a reader, not as a researcher, to go about these texts, how to read these texts and how to interpret them in a manner that even like political ideology, current political stream conveys it.
There are certain words I do not like because I do not understand them. One of them is something like deconstruction. It's a very fashionable word. I don't understand what it means. I don't also understand what postmodern means, but let that be. I think the first step would be for you to ask yourself, will I read interpretations first or will I read the text first? If you begin to read the interpretations first, obviously you will be confused. So the logical thing to do is to read the text first, then read the interpretation.
And begin with the translation of Bhagavad by Bibek Debroy, first of all. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, the audience. Thank you very much, Bibek Da.
We wish to thank Bibek Debroy and Pushpesh Pant and Patrika Game Changer series